104.9 The X rocks. Breaking Benjamin, I Will Not Bow. All the numbers were there. There was one extra number. How come whenever we call international, there's always somewhat extra number?
I don't know.
It just it never wants to work out.
I always I'm like, oh, this is how you do it.
Yeah, exactly. And we never.
And then every time I mess up the same thing.
Black Sabbath and the rise of heavy metal music. We bring in Dr. Andrew Cope from the Music School of Staffordshire Performing Arts. Hi there. How are you?
Hi. How are you?
Fine, thanks. Yeah. What's happening in England tonight?
Well, in England tonight, there's a big football game going on, so I think it's all very quiet. Everybody's indoors watching that.
That's a big deal over there, isn't it?
Oh, very much so, yeah. Expectations are quite high for the national football team this time around at the World Cup.
In your lifetime, have you ever once been a soccer hooligan?
A soccer hooligan? No.
No. Have you
have to remember, I'm a school teacher.
Yeah,
you can't do stuff like
there
that.
could be people listening in.
Hey, guess what? All of a sudden you get out of town, things change, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's So let's talk about Black Sabbath and the rise of heavy metal music. You sat down and you wrote this book.
Yep.
Why'd you feel the need to write it?
It goes back quite a long time, really. I sort of grew up with the whole Black Sabbath thing and playing the guitar, and as a teenager, that was a big deal then, the whole Sabbath and Zeppelin thing, and, I sort of learned to play all the various music that those two bands did, and noticed that the way they composed the music was very, very different. So it's always been a big interest to me. And then probably 15 years ago, somebody was doing a quiz, and there was a question of who invented heavy metal. And the answer was supposedly Led Zeppelin, which I completely disagreed with. So I decided it was about time that somebody said something about what was the real difference between Sabbath and Zeppelin, and, where did heavy metal come from, and what exactly is heavy metal, because, many of the writings on heavy metal about the cultural side of things, but nobody had really written anything about the musical aspect of it, if you like.
So, in your definition, what is heavy metal?
It's a complex thing, but certainly one of the important things would be to do with the what we call the intervals in the music. It's getting a bit techy and geeky, I suppose.
Sure, go ahead, man. Get techy.
But,
yeah.
Like a musical interval is the distance between one note and the next note that you play. So some intervals can be like very, very small. For example, if you think of a keyboard, you go from one key to the next, like a white key to a black key. That's what you would call a semitone. And then any amount of semitones larger than that, and they're all called different intervals. And in heavy metal, two of the intervals that seem to recur would be very important to what we call a tritone and a flat second. The flat second is just one semitone sound, and the tritone is 6 semitones. And you would instantly recognize those things. You would instantly recognize the tritone. It's called Diabolus in Musica, the devil in the music. It's got a very distinct sort of sound that's sort of become associated with evil in horror films and that sort of thing.
Yeah, you weren't supposed to play those notes. That was the devil's music.
Sorry?
You weren't supposed to play those those notes.
No, absolutely. Well, the thing about it though is, of course, that they're not confined to heavy metal. They occur in all kinds of music, but it's the context in which they combine, and along with things like detuned guitars and the sort of power chord riffing and that sort of thing.
So when these guys were putting this stuff together, were they that technical about it, or did they just go with what sounded right to them?
Well, probably they just played certain intervals and heard the sounds and thought, you know what, that sounds really different. Let's try and create a sound and an image around that. I know, like Geezer Butler, the bass player in Black Sabbath, as were they all to an extent, interested in the Hammer horror films and such like, and the idea of Black Sabbath as a name was inspired by the Three Faces of Fear, which was one of the films starring Boris Karloff, and they were thinking, well, that's really different. If we could create in music that effect where we're scaring people to death, or scaring the whole planet to death, as they put it, then that would be a really new take on music. So they would have heard all those sounds like the tritones and the flat seconds in sort of orchestral music, and the Bond theme and other sort of crime type movies, and then sort of translated that into a new soundscape, if you like, by sort of dropping the strings on the guitar to create the sort of the down-tuned power chord sound that became associated with Black Sabbath.
Black Sabbath and the Rise of Heavy Metal Music is the book, and we say hi to Dr. Andrew Culp, and he's over there in England. What is it that you find fabulous about this music?
Well, that's a really good question. I suppose we all respond differently to music, but for me, it's the drive, the down tuning, the more modern Beth, with the sort of the percussive elements, with the double kicks from the drum kit and so on, that sort of really drive it is tremendously interesting, and also the fact that it's very technical, so it has certain sort of associations with maybe classical music in a way that popular music generally doesn't have. Like progressive rock maybe and heavy metal are similar in that they sort of use these very extended structures and very complex musical ideas. And being a trained musician and so on, that side of it has always appealed to me. So it's the sort of the rock drive of the music combined with the technicalities of it.
Back in the day when Zeppelin and Sabbath were both, still playing and stuff, were there people that were, just Zeppelin and just Sabbath, and they were against each other?
You mean with Zeppelin and Sabbath?
Yeah, Zeppelin and Sabbath. Like were there two different groups of people?
Yeah, I think they had a very similar fan base. When they were in the heyday, like in the early 70s, I was a teenager, and we used to go along to, because they used to gig constantly at that time at all the small venues, so you could probably go and see them 2 or 3 times every year, and the same crowd of people would turn up at the same place, and you would make friends with people who went to all the same gigs. So it was pretty much the same sort of crowd. There wasn't sort of this Sabbath versus Zeppelin thing going on that seems to have emerged in later times.
What about the Birmingham? You got Sabbath and Judas Priest, both from that town.
Yeah.
And basically that's your basis for heavy metal. Without that, do you think heavy metal would be what it is today?
No, I think Birmingham played a very important part in the development of heavy metal. One of the things I look at in the book, like a whole chapter dedicated to that, are all the sort of whys and wherefores of that, and why not, other cities in the UK, why it didn't happen there, and so on. But there was lots of things that came together in Birmingham. One of the things, obviously, was the industrial side of things. Bill Ward talked about lying in bed at night, being able to hear the pounding in the foundries and so on, and he'd be sort of drumming along on the headboard, and he could hear these various sounds in his head. Judas Priest has said similar sort of thing. So I think a lot of the sort of percussive elements of that came from that. And then of course it was bombed to nothing, like in the war, and the time that Black Sabbath emerged was a time of sort of burnt out churches and destroyed buildings. It was a very sort of grey, desolate place. As were other cities, of course. But it's just like the way that various things all combined, that all came together at that time.
As you started researching this whole book and going through everything, how easy was it for you to find the information you were looking for? Were people readily available just to hand it over to you?
Well, I originally did this as a PhD, so obviously one of the things about that is that, you're doing something that's original that when nobody has been before. So it was a little bit sort of difficult in that respect, but a lot of the research work that I did was actually based on listening to the recordings and dissecting the recordings in a musical way. So a lot of it is about that. The sort of one aspect of it, of course, that wasn't was the whole Birmingham thing. But the great thing about researching like now is the internet is absolute gold mine. Mm-hmm. And not only for information that you can find, but like through people that you can find in contacts.
So what you're telling me here, Dr. Andrew L. Cope, is that when I say doctor in front of it, you actually have the doctor in front of your name because of Black Sabbath and heavy metal.
Absolutely right.
That is ridiculous, right there. It's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard.
That is awesome.
Now,
I am jealous.
If I saw you walking down the street, would I consider you to be a metalhead?
I think it would be pretty obvious that I was. I've still got the long hair and the ponytail and the sort of metal goatee and all the rest of it, and the tattoos, but I have to try and keep some sort of semblance of respectability being a teacher.
And Black Sabbath and the rise.